The recycled air in the cabin always smelled like a mixture of industrial disinfectant and the collective anxiety of 300 strangers. But today, it felt heavy, almost viscous, as if the oxygen itself was being rationed. I sat in seat 4A, my fingers tracing the worn leather of my vintage briefcase, a relic from my 30 years as a professor of historiography at Harvard. I was 72 years old, a man who had spent his life deciphering the patterns of the past, yet I had been blind to the shifting tectonic plates within my own bloodline. Across the aisle, my son, Julian Sterling, was adjusting his silk tie for the 10th time. Julian carried the Sterling name with a sort of frantic entitlement, his old money charisma starting to fray at the edges like a cheap suit. Beside him sat his wife, Sloane. If Julian was the fading flame of our legacy, Sloane was the frost that intended to extinguish it. She was a woman of clinical precision, a high-level administrator at one of the most prestigious medical centers in Boston, and she moved through life with the cold, calculated grace of a predator who had never known hunger, only ambition. "You look a bit peaked, Alaric," Sloane said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that felt like corn syrup over a razor blade. "Are you sure you're up for the flight to East Hampton?" "The humidity can be so taxing on the heart." "I've survived 7 decades of New England winters, Sloane," I replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "A little coastal air won't be the thing that breaks me. We just want you to be safe, Dad," Julian added. But he wouldn't look at me. He was staring at the seat back in front of him, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. I didn't know it then, but that was the first open loop in the tragedy that was about to unfold. I assumed it was just the usual tension: Julian's mounting debts, Sloane's thinly veiled disdain for my outdated frugality. We were supposedly headed to our family estate on the coast for a week of reconciliation, a quality time trip they called it, fully paid, all arrangements handled by Sloane. It was the first time in 3 years they'd shown me anything resembling affection. And despite my training in spotting historical fallacies, I wanted to believe it was real. I wanted to believe my son still loved me. The plane began its slow taxi toward the runway. The safety video played on the small screens, a choreographed dance of oxygen masks and life vests that no one ever watches until it's too late. I closed my eyes, trying to settle the strange, gnawing intuition in my gut. Patterns. Alaric. Look for the patterns. 10 minutes later, as the fasten seatbelt sign chimed, a flight attendant approached my row. Her name tag read Cassidy, and she had the kind of eyes that had seen too many red-eye flights and too much human wreckage. She leaned over me, ostensibly to check if my tray table was locked, but as she leaned down, her hair brushed my ear. "Pretend you're having a medical episode," she whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound beneath the roar of the engines. "Get off this plane now." I froze. My heart, which had been steady a moment ago, gave a sharp, painful thud against my ribs. I looked up at her, my mouth opening to ask for clarification, but she was already moving away, her professional mask firmly in place as she checked the next row. I looked at Julian and Sloane. They were both buried in their phones, their faces illuminated by the pale blue light of their screens, oblivious, or so I thought. "Is everything okay, Alaric?" Sloane asked, not looking up from her device. "You've gone quite pale." I think I left my medication in the terminal," I stammered, my mind racing. "The digitalis for my arrhythmia." "Don't be silly, Dad," Julian said, his voice sharp, almost panicked. "I saw you pack it. It's in your checked luggage. You'll be fine until we land." "It's a short flight." "No," I said, the weight of Cassidy's warning beginning to sink into my marrow. "I need it. I feel a tightness." What happened next changed everything. I didn't just feel a tightness. I felt the cold realization that my own son was lying to me. I hadn't packed my medication in my checked bag. I always kept it in my breast pocket. I reached in and felt the small plastic vial. Julian knew I kept it there. He had watched me take a pill before we left the house. So why was he telling me it was in the hold? Why was he so desperate for me to stay in this seat? I looked back toward the galley. Cassidy was watching me. Her hands were trembling as she held a carafe of water. She didn't look like a woman playing a prank. She looked like a woman who was watching a man walk toward his own execution. I made a choice. It was the most important performance of my life. I let my briefcase slide from my lap, the heavy thud echoing in the cabin. I slumped forward, my hand clutching my chest, letting out a strangled, wet gasp that I'd heard once in a hospital ward years ago. "My chest," I groaned, the sound tearing from my throat. I can't breathe." The reaction was instantaneous. The cabin erupted into controlled chaos. Cassidy was at my side in seconds, her face a mask of practiced concern, but her grip on my arm was firm, a silent message of, "Keep going, we have a medical emergency," she shouted, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the passengers. "Clear the aisle, we need to return to the gate." Through the haze of my feigned agony, I watched my son. Julian didn't reach for me. He didn't cry out. He stood up, but his movement was jerky, aggressive. He looked at Sloane, and for a split second, I saw it, the mask slipped. It wasn't worry on their faces. It was fury, pure, unadulterated disappointment. Sloane's eyes darted to the galley, then back to me, her lips thinning into a hard white line. "He's just stressed," Sloane said to the approaching lead steward, her voice loud and authoritative. "He has these panic attacks. Just give him some water in a moment. We don't need to turn the plane around." "Ma'am, he's gray," the steward replied, pushing past her. "We are not taking chances at 30,000 feet. Captain, we're heading back." As the plane pivoted on the tarmac, the engines whining in protest, I stayed slumped in my seat, eyes half closed. I felt the vibration of the wheels hitting the gate. I felt the rush of paramedics boarding the craft. They lifted me onto a gurney, the movements brisk and clinical. As they wheeled me down the aisle, I caught one last glimpse of Julian. He was slumped in his seat, his head in his hands. But Sloane was staring at Cassidy Vane. It was a look of such concentrated venom that it made my skin crawl. It was the look of someone who had just seen $1 million investment go up in smoke. They wheeled me through the jetway and back into the sterile, echoing halls of the airport. The paramedics were talking to me, asking for my name, my age, my symptoms. I gave them the basics, playing the role of the confused, ailing patriarch. They moved me into a private triage room near the gate to stabilize me before transport to a local hospital. Once the door was shut and the primary medic stepped out to check my vitals on the monitor, the door opened again. It wasn't a doctor. It was Cassidy. She had slipped away from her flight duties, her uniform slightly rumpled, her face deathly pale. She looked over her shoulder, then closed the door and locked it. "Mr. Sterling," she whispered, leaning over the gurney. "Listen to me. I don't have much time before they come looking for me." "Why did you do it?" I asked, my voice finally finding its natural strength. "Why tell me to get off?" She pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. She opened a voice memo and pressed play. The audio was grainy, muffled by the sound of a restroom hand dryer, but the voices were unmistakable. "The dose is already in his travel thermos." Sloane's voice hissed, clear and cold. "The altitude will do the rest. By the time they realize it's not a natural heart attack, we'll be over the Atlantic. The autopsy will be a formality in a small-town morgue. We need that estate, Julian. We need the Sterling Trust, or we're going to prison for the embezzlement." "I know," Julian's voice replied, sounding small, broken, but compliant. I didn't think it would be today." "Today is the only day that matters," Sloane snapped. $5 million, Julian. Think about the debt. Think about the life we're supposed to have." The recording cut off. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound I had ever heard. I looked at the ceiling, the fluorescent lights blurring as my eyes filled with tears. My son, my only child. He wasn't just waiting for me to die. He was the one holding the pillow. I overheard them in the lounge before boarding. Cassidy said, her voice trembling, "I've seen people like them before. My own sister. She wasn't so lucky. I couldn't let it happen again. Not on my watch." I sat up on the gurney, the paper crinkling beneath me. I wasn't an old man having a heart attack anymore. I was a man who had just realized he was living in a den of vipers. "Where is the plane now?" I asked. "They're prepping for takeoff again," Cassidy said. "They told your son and his wife they had to stay on board or lose their seats, and Sloane insisted they keep going to prepare the house for your arrival once you're discharged. They think you're going to the hospital. They think they have a few hours to figure out a new plan." I looked at the door. I could hear the paramedics returning. My mind, trained to analyze the rise and fall of empires, began to stitch together a new narrative. "Cassidy," I said, grabbing her hand, "do you still have that recording?" "I do." "Send it to me. And then, I need you to do one more thing." I didn't know it yet, but the man who had boarded that plane, the soft-hearted professor who wanted to believe in family, had died the moment that recording started. The man sitting on this gurney was someone else entirely. "What do you need?" she asked. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window of the triage room. My eyes were cold, reflecting the steel of a man who had nothing left to lose and a legacy to protect. "I need a lawyer," I said, "and I need to make sure my son thinks I'm already dead." The paramedics eventually transferred me to St. Jude's Memorial, a private facility where the quiet was so absolute it felt like being buried alive in expensive linens. I lay in the high thread count bed, watching the digital clock on the wall blink away the seconds of my life. My episode had been diagnosed as a severe panic attack exacerbated by exhaustion, exactly the cover I needed. While the world believed Alaric Sterling was fighting for his life in a cardiac ward, I was actually staring at the flight tracker on my phone. Flight 882. It had landed in East Hampton 40 minutes ago. Somewhere on that coastal stretch of luxury and old secrets, Julian and Sloane were likely sitting in the back of a chauffeured town car, perhaps holding hands, mourning the tragedy that hadn't quite happened yet. Or perhaps they were already pivot planning, wondering if the heart attack at the airport would finish the job they'd started with a poisoned thermos. I leaned back against the pillows, closing my eyes. I needed to understand how I had missed the rot. As a historian, I had spent my career telling students that the fall of an empire never happens overnight. It's a slow erosion of values, a series of small, ignored compromises that eventually leave the structure hollow. I should have seen the signs 3 years ago, shortly after my wife, Eleanor, passed away. Eleanor had been the glue, the moral compass of the Sterling name. When she died, Julian didn't just grieve, he seemed to untether. He had always been a Sterling, prestigious, educated at the finest institutions, but he lacked the grit that had built our family's wealth in the shipping industry. He wanted the lifestyle of the Gilded Age without the labor of the modern one. Then came Sloane. I remember the first time he brought her to the Gables, our estate in the Berkshires. She was wearing a dress that cost more than a teacher's monthly salary, and a smile that felt like a curated exhibit. She was a Kensington by birth, a family with a name as sharp as their business practices. She spoke of her work at the medical center with a cold, terrifying efficiency. Within 6 months, they were married. Within a year, Julian had convinced me to make him the treasurer of the Sterling Educational Foundation. "It'll give me a sense of purpose, Dad," he'd said, sitting in my study surrounded by my collection of rare 18th century manuscripts. "I want to carry on the legacy." I had patted his shoulder, blinded by the hope that my son was finally growing into the man I'd raised him to be. I didn't know then that I was handing the fox the keys to the henhouse. I didn't know that Julian's purpose was actually a desperate attempt to cover the massive gambling debts he'd racked up at underground high-stakes tables in Macau and New York. The first real red flag appeared 8 months ago, though at the time, I'd dismissed it as the simple forgetfulness of age. I had gone to my study to find my grandfather's gold pocket watch, a piece that had survived the Great Depression and 2 world wars. It wasn't in its velvet-lined box. I searched for hours, my heart racing, convinced I'd misplaced it. When I asked Sloane if she'd seen it, she looked at me with a pained, pitying expression. "Alaric, dear," she'd said, resting a cool hand on mine. "You gave that to Julian for his birthday last month, don't you remember? We had a whole dinner for it." I had frozen. I didn't remember. I couldn't remember a dinner, a gift, or even a conversation about the watch. For the next few days, I lived in a state of quiet terror. Was it starting? Was the Sterling mind finally beginning to fray? Looking back now from this hospital bed, I realized that dinner never happened. The watch hadn't been a gift. It had been liquidated to pay off a margin call. Sloane hadn't been comforting me. She was gaslighting me, planting the seeds of cognitive decline that would eventually form the basis of their legal argument for my incompetency. They played the long game. Little things started disappearing. My reading glasses, my car keys, important bills would go unpaid, only for Sloane to find them tucked into books I hadn't touched in years. "You're just tired, Alaric," she would whisper. "Let Julian handle the foundation's accounts for a while. You shouldn't have to worry about the numbers anymore." By the time we boarded that plane to Miami, they had me convinced I was a shell of my former self. I had started to rely on them for everything, my schedule, my medication, my very reality. I had become a guest in my own life, a ghost haunting the halls of the Gables while they measured the drapes for my funeral. "Mr. Sterling?" The door to my hospital room opened. It wasn't a nurse. It was a man in a charcoal gray suit that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He carried a leather briefcase that matched my own, but his was newer, sharper. "I'm Elias Montgomery," he said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded immediate respect. "Cassidy Vane called me. She said you might have a historical discrepancy that needs correcting." Elias was old money legal royalty. His firm had represented the Sterlings for 3 generations, though Julian had tried to move our business to a smaller, more modern firm months ago, a move I had luckily blocked out of sheer habit. "Elias," I said, sitting up, feeling a surge of genuine strength, "I need to know how much they've taken." Elias sat in the chair beside my bed, his expression grim. He didn't offer platitudes. He opened his laptop and turned the screen toward me. "I took the liberty of doing a preliminary audit of the Sterling Foundation accounts the moment Cassidy sent me that recording," he said. "Julian hasn't just been managing the funds, Alaric, he's been hemorrhaging them. In the last 6 months, over $2 million has been diverted into offshore accounts linked to a shell company called Vane Kensington Holdings." I flinched at the name, Sloane's maiden name. She wasn't even trying to hide it from those who knew where to look. She just assumed I'd never look. "And the insurance?" I asked, my voice cracking. "That's the most concerning part," Elias said, his fingers dancing across the keys. "A new policy was taken out 4 months ago. $5 million, accidental death and dismemberment, with a specific rider for travel-related incidents. The signature on the application. It's good, Alaric. A very sophisticated forgery of your hand. But there's a digital footprint. The application was submitted from a computer at the Kensington Medical Center. Sloane's office," I whispered. "Exactly." Elias leaned back, his eyes sharp. "They weren't just waiting for you to die. They were engineering a scenario where your death would be the most profitable event in Julian's life. They've already filed a preliminary petition for emergency temporary guardianship in the East Hampton courts, claiming you suffered a massive mental breakdown at the airport." The room felt cold. My own son had already filed the paperwork to erase my autonomy while I was still breathing. They were at the estate right now, likely celebrating their inheritance while the ink was still wet on the petition. "They think I'm incapacitated in a hospital," I said, a slow, dark fire beginning to burn in my chest. "They think they've won." "For the moment, yes," Elias replied. "The court has granted the temporary order based on the medical history. Sloane provided records of your supposed dementia, signed by a doctor, Eris Thorne. Do you know him?" "Never heard of him." We checked. Dr. Thorne is a disgraced neurologist who lost his license in Vermont for selling prescriptions. He's currently on Sloane's payroll as a consultant at her clinic. AF. The trap was so much deeper than I had imagined. It wasn't just a murder plot. It was a total assassination of my character, my history, and my future. They had spent months building a fiction where I was a bumbling, senile old man, all so they could step into my shoes without anyone asking questions. "What do we do?" I asked. Elias stood up, closing his laptop with a decisive click. "In historiography, Alaric, the most powerful tool you have is the primary source, the truth that cannot be debated. We are going to let them play their hand, let them think the guardianship is active, let them start moving the money. The more they touch, the more evidence they leave." "And me?" "You are going to stay dead to them for a few days," Elias said, a faint predatory smile touching his lips. "I have a private villa in Connecticut. No one knows I own it. You'll stay there, with a private medical team I trust. We're going to conduct our own cognitive evaluation, one that will be filmed, notarized, and witnessed by the top 3 neurologists in the country. And then?" "And then," Elias said, "we're going to show Julian and Sloane that the Sterling legacy isn't built on money. It's built on the one thing they don't have, the truth." I nodded, feeling a cold resolve settle over me. But as Elias walked toward the door, he stopped and looked back. "There's one more thing, Alaric. I ran a background check on the travel arrangements. That fully paid trip to Miami, the tickets were one way for you. But for Julian and Sloane, they had return flights booked for the following day, from a different airport, under different names." The breath caught in my throat. They weren't just planning for me to die on the plane. They were planning to vanish the moment they landed, leaving my body to be handled by strangers while they disappeared with the insurance money. "I need to go home," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Not to the villa. I need to go to the Gables. It's not safe, Alaric. They've changed the security codes. They have legal control of the property now." "I built that house, Elias," I said, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. "I know every secret passage, every hidden safe, and every camera blind spot. If they want to play the role of the morning heirs, I'm going to give them a ghost story they'll never forget." I stood up, the hospital gown fluttering around my legs, but I felt taller than I had in years. I had spent my life studying the past. It was time to start weaponizing it. But as I reached for my clothes, my phone, the one I'd kept hidden from the nurses, vibrated on the nightstand. It was a text from an unknown number. "I know you didn't die at the airport, Professor, and I know what's hidden in the wall behind the library." I stared at the screen, the blood draining from my face. Julian didn't know about the library wall. Sloane didn't either. There was only one other person who knew the secrets of the Gables, and she had been dead for 3 years. Or so I thought. The text message glowed like a radioactive coal in the darkened hospital room. "I know what's hidden in the wall behind the library." My breath hitched. That secret compartment was a relic of the Prohibition era, something my father had shown me when I was 10. I had only ever shared its location with one person, my wife, Eleanor. To everyone else, that wall was nothing but solid mahogany and leather-bound editions of Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. "Is everything all right, Alaric?" Elias asked, noticing my sudden rigidity. "The patterns are shifting again," I whispered, sliding the phone into my pocket. I didn't tell him about the message. In the world of high-stakes betrayal, information was the only currency that maintained its value, and I wasn't ready to spend this particular coin just yet. I need to get to the estate. Now. Elias arranged for a private car, a nondescript black sedan that didn't scream sterling wealth. As we drove through the winding, fog-shrouded roads of the Berkshires toward the Gables, I watched the skeletal trees clawing at the moon. This house had been my sanctuary for 40 years. Now, it was a crime scene in the making. We pulled up to the service entrance, a narrow dirt track used by gardeners and caterers, hidden by a thicket of overgrown rhododendrons. I had the driver cut the lights a quarter-mile out. "I'll be waiting at the rendezvous point in 2 hours, Elias said, checking his watch. "If you're not there, I'm calling the state police. Ghost story be damned." I stepped out into the biting night air. I didn't enter through the front. Sloane would have surely upgraded the peripheral security. Instead, I moved toward the old carriage house. Beneath the floorboards of the tool shed was a crawl space that led directly into the basement of the main house. It was a passage I hadn't used since Julian was a child playing hide-and-seek. Back then, it was a game of love. Now, it was a tactical infiltration. The air in the crawl space was thick with the scent of damp earth and old coal dust. I moved slowly, my joints protesting, but my mind was focused with a clarity I hadn't felt in decades. I emerged in the wine cellar, the rows of dusty Bordeaux standing like silent witnesses. I climbed the narrow spiral stairs and pressed my ear against the oak door leading to the kitchen. Silence. Then, the rhythmic clink of a spoon against fine china. "He's officially critical but stable." Julian's voice drifted through the door. He sounded different. There was an edge of hysterical relief in his tone. "The hospital said he's not conscious. We have at least 48 hours before anyone starts asking why we aren't at his bedside. We are preparing the family affairs, Julian." Sloane's voice was like ice cracking. "That's our official line. We're the grieving, proactive children. Did you get the ledger from the safe?" "I'm working on it. The combination." "He changed it, Sloane. I tried his birthday, Mom's birthday, the anniversary. Nothing works." "Think, you idiot," she snapped. "He's a historian. It's a date. A battle, a signing of a treaty, something obscure." I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The combination wasn't a family date. It was the 24th of October, 1648, the signing of the Peace of Westphalia. I had taught Julian about it a dozen times. He had never listened. I moved away from the door, my footsteps silent on the heavy Persian rugs of the back hallway. I made my way toward the library. The room was dark, the air smelling of beeswax and old paper. I moved to the third shelf on the north wall, behind the oversized volumes of Victorian maps. I pressed the hidden latch. The mahogany panel hummed and slid back 6 inches. I reached into the darkness, expecting to find the emergency cash and the original deed to the house. Instead, my hand brushed something cold. Metal. I pulled it out. It was a digital recorder, identical to the one Cassidy had shown me, but older. Taped to it was a small, cream-colored envelope with my name written in a hand that made my knees buckle. "Eleanor." My heart hammered against my ribs as I flipped open the recorder and pressed play. My wife's voice, frail but steady, filled the small space between the bookshelves. "Alaric, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and the fear I've carried for months has finally taken root. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to tell you and break your heart while we were still together. But I've been watching them, Julian and Sloane. They didn't wait for my illness to take hold. They started assisting it. Sloane was the one bringing me my evening tea, Alaric. She thought I was too far gone to notice her switching the vials. But I'm a Sterling wife, and I know when a predator is in my kitchen. I slumped against the wall, the air leaving my lungs in a ragged sob. Eleanor hadn't just died of natural causes. They had practiced on her. They had refined their method of slow chemical erasure on the woman who gave Julian life. I've hidden the tea samples in the false bottom of the silver chest in the dining room. The recording continued, Eleanor's voice cracking. And Alaric, Sloane isn't just a Kensington. She's working with Silas Blackwood. He's the one Julian owes the gambling debts to. They aren't just taking your money. They're handing the Sterling legacy over to the very people who want to burn it down. Please, my love, be the historian. Look at the evidence. Don't let them win. The recording ended with a soft click. I stood in the dark, the weight of a decade of betrayal finally settling into a singular, cold purpose. It wasn't just about my life anymore. It was about Eleanor. Suddenly, the library lights flickered on. I spun around, my hand still gripping the recorder. Standing in the doorway was a figure I didn't expect. Not Julian, not Sloane. It was Silas Blackwood. He was a man built of sharp angles and shadow, his eyes as dark as the ink on a death warrant. He leaned against the doorframe, tossing a heavy brass key, my key, into the air and catching it. "The professor returns from the dead," Silas said, his voice a gravelly purr. "I told Sloane you were too stubborn to die in a tin can over the ocean." "How did you get in here, Silas?" I asked, my voice steady, despite the roar of blood in my ears. "Your son is very generous when he's terrified," Silas said, walking into the room. He trailed a finger over the spine of a rare book, his touch a profanation. He gave me the keys to the kingdom in exchange for another week's grace on his Macau debts. "But you're the real prize, Alaric. You're the one who knows where the offshore foundations are buried. You'll never touch them." "Oh, I think I will." Silas smiled, and I saw the grit of the underworld in his teeth. "Because while you were playing ghost in the basement, Sloane was busy. She's not just filing for guardianship anymore. She's called the police, Alaric. She's reporting an intruder, a dangerously delusional old man who escaped from the hospital and is currently threatening her in her own home." In the distance, the low, rhythmic wail of a siren began to climb the hill toward the estate. "Julian is upstairs right now, bruising his own face," Silas whispered, leaning in close. "By the time the cops get here, you're not going to be a victim. You're going to be a violent lunatic who needs to be sedated and locked away for good. And once you're in the state ward, I'll have all the time in the world to make you sign those papers." I looked at the recorder in my hand. I looked at the hidden compartment. I had the evidence, but Silas had the clock. "I didn't come here to hide, Silas," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face that seemed to give even a man like him pause. "I came here to teach one final lesson." "And what's that?" "In history," I said, reaching into my pocket and gripping the second device I'd brought from the hospital. "The winner isn't the one with the most soldiers. It's the one who controls the narrative." I pressed a button on the small remote. Suddenly, every screen in the house, the giant television in the media room, the tablets on the kitchen counter, the smart mirrors in the hallways lit up with a single, high-definition feed. It was the library. But it wasn't just showing us. It was broadcasting live. "Elias Montgomery didn't just drop me off, Silas," I said, as the sirens grew deafeningly loud. "He's been sitting at the end of the driveway with a satellite uplink. Every word you just said, every admission of Julian's debt, every mention of Sloane's intruder plot, it's being streamed directly to the district attorney's office and the local news." Silas's face went from smug to ghostly in a heartbeat. From the floor above us, I heard a scream, Sloane's voice, high and panicked. "Julian, the TV! Turn it off! Why is the library on the TV?" I stood my ground as the front doors were kicked open. "Drop the key, Silas," I said. "Class is in session." But as the police swarmed into the library, guns drawn, I realized one terrifying thing. The text message I'd received at the hospital, the one that told me about the wall, hadn't come from Silas, and it hadn't come from Elias. I looked at the live feed on the library monitor. In the background, hidden in the shadows of the hallway behind the police, was a woman I recognized. She was wearing a medical scrub jacket from Sloane's clinic, and she was smiling at me. It was Cassidy Vane, the flight attendant, but as she stepped into the light for a fleeting second, I saw the name on her ID badge. It wasn't Cassidy Vane. It was Cassidy Sterling. My heart stopped. I didn't have a daughter. Or did I? The flash of the cameras and the sudden intrusion of blue and red strobes against the mahogany walls of the library should have been the signal of my victory. But as I looked at the woman standing in the shadows, the woman who looked exactly like a younger Eleanor, the air in my lungs felt like lead. "Cassidy?" I breathed, the name barely audible over the shouting of the officers securing Silas Blackwood. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She just watched me with those eyes, Eleanor's eyes, but hardened by a life I hadn't been a part of. Before I could take a step toward her, the chaos of the room surged. "Alaric Sterling." "Get away from the window," an officer barked, mistaking my shock for an attempt to flee. "I'm the one who called you," I roared back, my professor's voice projecting with an authority that silenced the room. I pointed a trembling finger at the television screens, which were still broadcasting the frozen image of Silas and Julian's admission. "Check the uplink. My attorney, Elias Montgomery, is at the gate. He has the full recording of the murder plot against me." Sloane was being led down the grand staircase in handcuffs, her silk robe fluttering. She wasn't screaming anymore. She was silent, her face a mask of calculated fury as she looked at me. Julian was behind her, sobbing openly, his old money dignity completely dissolved into the pathetic mess of a man who had realized the safety net of his father's mercy had finally snapped. But as the police cleared the hallway, I looked back to where the woman had been. The space was empty. The door to the servants' passage was ajar, a sliver of darkness in the brilliantly lit corridor. "Elias." I shouted into my phone the moment I was cleared by the lead detective. There was someone else in the house, a woman. She looks like Eleanor. She had a badge from Sloane's clinic. "Alaric, calm down." Elias's voice was strained. He was already at the front door, flanked by 2 junior associates. Sloane had dozens of staff. It was likely just a disgruntled employee helping us. "We have what we need. Julian and Sloane are in custody. The foundation accounts are being frozen as we speak." "No," I said, my heart hammering. "She sent me the text about the library wall. She knew about the recording Eleanor left. Sloane didn't know. Julian didn't know. Only Eleanor and I knew." Elias paused, and I could hear the gears of his legal mind grinding. "We'll find her, Alaric. But right now, we have to deal with the immediate threat." The police found the thermos in the car. They're running a preliminary talk screen. "If it matches what was in your wife's medical records, this isn't just fraud, it's a double homicide investigation." The word homicide echoed through the empty library. I sat in my wingback chair, the same one where I'd sat with Eleanor for 30 years, and felt the crushing weight of the silence. My son was gone, my wife had been murdered, and I was left in a museum of my own making, surrounded by the ghosts of a family that had never really existed the way I thought it did. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours in the library, the lights turned low, staring at the empty space in the wall. I went back to the recorder. I played Eleanor's voice over and over, searching for a clue I might have missed. "Sloane isn't just a Kensington. She's working with Silas Blackwood. He's the one Julian owes the gambling debts to. They aren't just taking your money." I paused. There was a faint sound in the background of the recording, a rhythmic thump-thump like a heartbeat or perhaps someone walking on the floor above. And then, a voice, a younger, female voice whispering something indistinct. I enhanced the audio on my laptop, a skill I'd picked up during a sabbatical year studying digital forensics for historical preservation. "Don't worry, Mom. I won't let them hurt him." The breath left my body. "Mom." The woman in the hallway. She hadn't been an employee. She had been there with Eleanor. I didn't know it yet, but the sterling history I had spent my life writing was a lie. I thought I knew every branch of our family tree, every scandal buried in the archives. But Eleanor had a secret of her own, a secret she had kept from me to protect me, or perhaps to protect the person she'd hidden away. At 4 a.m., my hidden security app chimed. Someone was at the service gate. I didn't call the police. I didn't call Elias. I walked out into the pre-dawn mist, my coat pulled tight against the chill. Standing by the rhododendrons was the woman. Up close, the resemblance was even more terrifying. She had the same high cheekbones, the same slight tilt to her chin, but she was wearing a tactical jacket, and her eyes held a hardness that Eleanor never possessed. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice cracking. "I'm the insurance policy you didn't know you had," she said. Her voice was low, melodic, and held the unmistakable cadence of a Sterling. "My name is Claire, and I've been living in the shadows of this family since before Sloane Kensington even knew Julian existed." Eleanor never mentioned. "We never." "You didn't have a daughter, Alaric," Claire said, stepping into the light of my flashlight. "But Eleanor had a sister." A sister who died in a tragic accident 35 years ago, right around the time you were being scouted for the Harvard chair. The family, the real Sterling elders, paid to make her disappear because she was unstable. She wasn't. She just knew too much about where the original Sterling fortune came from. Shipping, I whispered. It was shipping. It was human trafficking, Alaric, Claire said, her eyes flashing with a cold, historical fire. The shipping was a front for the Blackwood family's ancestors. That's why Silas thinks he owns this house. He has the original ledgers. He was blackmailing Julian, and Julian was too weak to fight him, so he and Sloane decided to kill you to pay him off. I felt the ground shift beneath me. My entire legacy, the prestigious, old money Sterling name, was built on a foundation of blood and misery. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because Sloane isn't done, Claire said, reaching into her jacket and pulling out a tablet. Look at the news. I looked. The headlines were already shifting. Alaric Sterling, the truth behind the Harvard professor's miraculous escape. Sloane's legal team hadn't just filed a defense. They had launched a counteroffensive. They were leaking documents forged, perhaps, but convincing that suggested I had been the one poisoning Eleanor. They were claiming that Julian and Sloane had uncovered my crimes, and that the airport incident was my attempt to eliminate the only witnesses to my wife's murder. She's making me the villain, I whispered. She's a Kensington, Claire said. They don't play to win, they play to destroy. And with Silas Blackwood in her ear, she has enough evidence to make the public believe you're the monster. The police are already on their way back here to execute a new search warrant. They aren't looking for Julian's thermos anymore, Alaric. They're looking for the poison you supposedly hid. The sirens began again in the distance, but this time, they weren't coming to save me. They were coming to finish what Sloane had started. What do? I asked, looking at this stranger who carried my wife's face. You do what historians do, Claire said, a dark smile touching her lips. You rewrite the ending, but you're going to need to get your hands dirty. Are you ready to stop being a professor and start being a Sterling? I looked back at the house, the grand, beautiful lie I had called home. Show me the way, I said. What happened next would change everything. I didn't know it then, but by the time the sun rose, the Alaric Sterling the world knew would be gone forever, and the revenge I was about to take wouldn't just be against Julian and Sloane. It would be against the very name I had spent my life trying to honor. The crunch of gravel under tires signaled the arrival of the state's hammer. I stood at the edge of the woods with Claire, watching as 4 cruisers swept up the driveway of the Gables, their high beams slicing through the fog like the eyes of hungry wolves. I had spent 40 years being a man of letters, a man of peace, but watching the flashing lights illuminate the facade of my home, I felt a primitive, jagged instinct take hold. My home was being invaded, not by criminals, but by the law, weaponized by a woman who had calculated my destruction before she'd even finished her wedding vows. We have exactly 6 minutes before they establish a perimeter, Claire whispered. She wasn't looking at the police. She was looking at a ruggedized tablet, watching a set of heat signature feeds I didn't recognize. There's a fallout shelter built into the limestone beneath the west wing. It was installed in '62, but the ventilation shafts connect to the old root cellar. That's where we're going. How do you know about a fallout shelter? I asked, my voice barely a breath. I've lived here half my life and I never knew it existed. Your father didn't trust the government, Alaric, and he certainly didn't trust his business partners in the Blackwood family, she replied, grabbing my arm and pulling me into the dense undergrowth. History isn't just what's written in the books you teach. It's the architecture of the things people are too afraid to say out loud. We moved through the shadows, my lungs burning with the cold air and the sheer adrenaline of being a fugitive in my own backyard. We reached a weathered stone outcropping near the old servants' quarters. Claire shifted a heavy, moss-covered slab, revealing a rusted iron grate. With a strength that belied her frame, she heaved it aside and motioned for me to go first. I descended into a narrow, concrete-lined shaft that smelled of wet minerals and stale oxygen. At the bottom, a heavy steel door sat slightly ajar. Claire followed me in, sealing the hatch behind us. She clicked on a flashlight, and the beam swept over a room frozen in time. Crates of canned rations, a shortwave radio from the Cold War era, and stacks of filing cabinets that looked like they belonged in a government archive. This is the Sterling Insurance Office, Claire said, walking toward the cabinets. Whenever the family needed to make someone disappear or buy a politician, the records were kept here. Eleanor found it 3 years ago. That's when the accidents started happening to her. I slumped against a concrete wall, the weight of the betrayal feeling like a physical blow. Julian knew about this? No. Julian is a distraction, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Sloane is the one you should have been watching. She didn't marry Julian for the Sterling name. She married him for the Sterling leverage. She's been working with Silas Blackwood to find the shadow manifests, the documents that prove the Kensington family's wealth didn't come from textiles, but from the same human misery your ancestors profited from. It was a merger of blood, Alaric. I watched her pull a heavy, leather-bound ledger from a drawer. My historian's heart skipped a beat. This was the primary source. The missing link. I didn't know it yet, but the contents of this book would do more than just clear my name. It would destroy the very concept of the American elite I had spent my life studying. Look at this, Claire said, pointing to a page dated the 12th of June, 1991. It was a wire transfer. $5 million from a Sterling trust to a private account in the Cayman Islands. The memo line was a single, chilling word, amnesia. And the recipient? A holding company owned by Sloane's father, Arthur Kensington. They've been tied together for decades, I whispered. The Kensingtons and the Sterlings. It wasn't a marriage. It was a debt collection. Suddenly, the tablet in Claire's hand chirped. A video feed flickered to life. It was a hidden camera inside my study, just feet above where the police were currently conducting their search. I watched as a detective. I recognized a man named Miller who had often sat in the front row of my public lectures, carefully pulled a small, blue vial from behind a stack of my journals. Wait, I said, leaning toward the screen. I didn't put that there. Of course you didn't, Claire said. Detective Miller is on the Kensington payroll. He's finding the evidence Sloane planted weeks ago. Within the hour, the lab will confirm that the vial contains the same synthetic toxin that killed Eleanor. The narrative will be complete. Alaric Sterling, the jealous, aging professor, killed his wife and tried to frame his innocent son. The humiliation was visceral. I watched Miller hold the vial up to the light, a look of grim, manufactured satisfaction on his face. He looked directly into the camera, not knowing it was there, and I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. For 40 years, I had taught that history was written by the victors. I had always assumed that meant the side with the most truth. But Sloane had taught me a different lesson. History is written by the person who survives to tell the story. I'm going to be arrested, aren't I? I asked. If you stay here, yes, Claire said. But we're not staying. We're going to the one place Sloane would never look for you. The one place where the Kensingtons have no power. And where is that? The past, she said, handing me a heavy brass key from the ledger. We're going to the old Blackwood shipyard in South Boston. Silas thinks he's moved all his assets, but he forgot about the dead files. He's too young to remember how the old men used to hide their sins. We exited the shelter through a drainage tunnel that opened into a ravine a mile from the house. A battered, nondescript truck was waiting for us. As we drove away, I looked back at the silhouette of the gables on the hill. It looked like a tomb, glowing with the sterile light of police sirens. The drive to Boston was a blur of high-speed tension. I spent the time scrolling through the news on my phone. The transformation of my public image was breathtaking. Headlines that yesterday called me a respected scholar were now calling me a fugitive poisoner. Sloane had released a statement to the Boston Globe, her words expertly crafted to evoke sympathy. We are heartbroken by the revelations regarding my father-in-law, the statement read. Julian and I only ever wanted to protect him from his own declining mind. We never imagined the darkness he was hiding in that library. She's good, I muttered, gripping the phone until my knuckles ached. She's making me look like a monster so no one will listen when I tell the truth about her. Let her talk, Claire said, her eyes fixed on the road. The more she says, the more she commits to a story she can't take back. In 24 hours, every word of that statement is going to be a nail in her coffin. We arrived at the South Boston docks as the sun began to bleed a pale, sickly orange over the Atlantic. The Blackwood shipyard was a graveyard of rusted hulls and rotting timber, a place where the air tasted of salt and industrial decay. It was the physical manifestation of the Sterling fortune's dark heart. We moved into a derelict warehouse at the end of the pier. Inside, the silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic slapping of the tide against the pilings. Claire led me to a small office in the back, the windows boarded up with plywood. She kicked aside a pile of old shipping pallets, revealing a heavy floor safe. This is it, she said, handing me the brass key. This safe hasn't been opened since your father died. It contains the original partnership agreement between the Sterlings, the Kensingtons, and the Blackwoods, the unholy trinity. It proves that Sloane's family didn't just profit from the Sterling crimes, they orchestrated them. My hands shook as I knelt before the safe. I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying clunk. I swung the door open, expecting gold or ledgers. Instead, there was a single, modern-looking envelope, and on the front, in Sloane's elegant, clinical handwriting, was a single sentence. "I knew you'd come here eventually, Alaric. You always were a slave to the archives." I froze. A faint electronic beep began to emanate from the back of the safe. "Claire, get back!" I yelled, lunging toward her just as the warehouse doors behind us were kicked open. Flashlights flooded the room, blinding us. But it wasn't the police. These men were dressed in high-end tactical gear, their faces covered by black balaclavas. And walking in behind them, looking perfectly composed in a charcoal trench coat, was Sloane Kensington. She didn't have a gun. She didn't need one. She held a phone, and on the screen was a live feed of Julian, sitting in an interrogation room, looking terrified. "Hello, Alaric," she said, her voice echoing in the hollow space of the warehouse. "I must thank you. I've been looking for this key for 3 years. I knew Eleanor had hidden it, but I didn't think she'd be clever enough to give the location to a cleaner like Claire." I looked at Claire, my heart dropping. "A cleaner? Oh, did she not tell you?" Sloane smiled, a cold, triumphant expression. "Claire isn't your guardian angel, Alaric. She's a mercenary. She was working for Silas Blackwood, until I offered her a better deal. She brought you here so I could finish this without the police getting in the way." I turned to Claire, searching her face for a lie, but all I saw was a blank, professional coldness. She stepped away from me, moving toward Sloane's side. "Business is business, Professor," Claire said, her voice devoid of the warmth she'd used in the truck. "The Sterling name is dead. I'm just making sure I'm on the side that's still standing when the dust settles." Sloane stepped forward, reaching into the safe and pulling out the documents I had risked my life for. She held them up, her eyes gleaming with a terrifying old-money greed. "Now," Sloane said, "we're going to record a very special video. You're going to confess to Eleanor's murder, and you're going to sign over the remaining Sterling trusts to me. If you don't, Julian, your precious, weak-willed son, is going to have a suicide in his jail cell tonight. And trust me, Alaric, the police are very used to seeing desperate men take their own lives." I looked at the documents. I looked at my son's terrified face on the screen. I had hit rock bottom. I was a fugitive. My home was a crime scene. My allies were traitors, and my son was a hostage. But as Sloane leaned in, smelling of expensive perfume and cold ambition, I noticed something she had missed. In the back of the safe, beneath where the envelope had been, was a small, glowing red light. I didn't know it yet, but Sloane's arrogance was about to be her undoing. She thought she was the only one playing the long game. She had forgotten that I had spent 40 years grading the papers of people who thought they were smarter than they actually were. "I'll sign," I said, my voice low and steady. "But first I want you to tell me the truth. Did you enjoy killing Eleanor?" Sloane laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Enjoy it? No, Alaric. It was a chore. Like cleaning a smudge off a window. She was in the way of the legacy. Just like you are now." I looked directly into the hidden camera in the back of the safe, the one Claire had actually installed for me, not for Sloane. "Class is in session, Sloane," I whispered. "And you just failed the final exam." The warehouse sirens didn't start this time. Instead, the entire dock was suddenly bathed in the blinding white light of a dozen spotlights. Sloane's smile faltered. She turned toward the doors, her eyes wide with a sudden, dawning terror. "What is this?" she hissed. "It's the one thing you didn't account for," I said, standing up and brushing the dust from my suit. A historian never relies on a single source. The blinding spotlights turned the shipyard warehouse into a stage, and for the first time in her life, Sloane Kensington wasn't the director. She was the antagonist caught in the final act. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic groaning of the rusted pier pilings against the tide. Sloane's face, usually a masterpiece of clinical composure, began to fracture. She looked at Claire, then at the safe, then at the doors where the tactical teams were now breached, their rifles leveled with terrifying precision. "Alaric, what have you done?" she hissed, her voice a serrated blade of panic. "I didn't do anything, Sloane," I said, my voice sounding like gravel over velvet. "I simply allowed you to be yourself. A historian knows that a subject will always reveal their true nature if they believe they are unobserved or in total control. You believed both. Claire stepped away from Sloane, her posture shifting from a submissive mercenary to a woman of lethal efficiency. She reached into her tactical vest and pulled out a badge. But it wasn't for the local police. It was federal. Special Agent Claire Harrison, FBI, Organized Crime Division, she said, her voice echoing in the hollow space. And for the record, Sloane, I was never working for Silas Blackwood. I was working with Eleanor Sterling. She contacted us 6 months before her death when she realized the Kensington family was using the Sterling Foundation to launder the proceeds of Silas Blackwood's human trafficking ring. I felt the ground tilt. I had expected betrayal, but the scale of the rot was a canyon I hadn't been prepared to look into. My wife, Eleanor, the woman I thought I was protecting, had been a secret informant for the federal government. She had been fighting a war in our own home while I was busy debating the nuances of the French Revolution. Sloane lunged for the documents in the safe, her movements desperate, but Claire was faster. She intercepted Sloane with a practiced, brutal efficiency, pinning her against the concrete floor. The recording is already on a secure server, Sloane, Claire said, clicking handcuffs into place. Your confession to the poisoning, your admission of the blackmail, and your involvement with the Blackwood manifests. It's over. The warehouse doors were thrown open, and a sea of dark windbreakers with yellow lettering flooded the room. Among them was Elias Montgomery. He looked at me, his face a mixture of professional relief and personal sorrow. We have the warrants, Alaric, Elias said. The Kensington Medical Center is being raided as we speak. Dr. Thorne has already flipped. He's giving up everything, the fake prescriptions, the altered medical records, and the exact chemical composition of the toxin Sloane had him manufacture. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt the weight lift. But as I watched Sloane being led away, her eyes still darting, still searching for a way to manipulate the situation, I felt a crushing, hollow coldness. I looked at the shadow manifests, still sitting in the safe. I reached down and picked up the leather-bound ledger. I opened it to the middle, to the section Claire had mentioned. My eyes blurred as I read the names of ships, the prices paid for cargo, and the signatures at the bottom of each page. Harrison Sterling. Arthur Kensington, Silas Blackwood III. The Sterling wealth, the very money that had paid for my education, my home, my rare books, and the life of leisure I'd enjoyed, was soaked in the blood of people whose names had been erased from history. I wasn't just a victim of Sloane's greed. I was a beneficiary of a century of misery. I walked out of the warehouse and onto the pier. The salt air bit at my face, but I welcomed the pain. I stood at the edge of the water, looking out at the Atlantic, the same ocean that had carried those ships 100 years ago. I hit rock bottom then. Not because I was a fugitive, and not because I was poor, but because I realized my entire identity was a curated fiction. I was Alaric Sterling, the prestigious professor, but that title was bought with the lives of thousands of unnamed souls. My son was a monster because he was a product of a monstrous lineage. Alaric? I turned. Claire was standing behind me. Her expression softened. You didn't know, she said. Eleanor wanted to tell you, but she was afraid it would destroy you. She wanted to clean the slate before she revealed the truth. She died trying to fix a history I was too blind to see, I said, the words catching in my throat. I spent 40 years teaching students about the great men of history, Claire. I never realized I was living in the shadow of the worst ones. What are you going to do? She asked. I looked at the ledger in my hand. I looked at the lights of the city across the water. Sloane was in custody, Julian was in a cell, and the Kensington name was being dragged through the mud. But that wasn't enough. Punishment wasn't the same as justice. Sloane thinks she lost because she got caught. I said, a new, colder purpose beginning to crystallize in my mind. But she hasn't lost her power. She still has the offshore accounts. She still has the Blackwood connections. And the Sterling name. It still exists as a symbol of old money prestige. The FBI will seize the assets, Claire said. They'll seize the ones they find, I countered. But I know how the Sterlings hide things. I know the patterns. If I let the government handle this, it'll be tied up in courts for 20 years, and eventually, some cousin or associate will claw it back. No, I'm going to do what Eleanor started. I'm going to burn the Sterling name to the ground. I'm going to make sure there's nothing left to inherit. That's a dangerous game, Alaric. You're talking about dismantling a multi-billion-dollar power structure. I'm a historian, Claire, I said, meeting her eyes. I know exactly how to trigger a collapse. Every empire has a keystone. If you pull it, The whole thing comes down. The keystone isn't the money, it's the reputation. What happened next changed the nature of the fight. I didn't return to the Gables. I didn't go to a hotel. I went to the one place where I could work in total anonymity. A small, windowless basement office in the back of the Harvard archives. A place I still had the keys to. For the next 72 hours, I didn't sleep. I lived on black coffee and the raw, electric hum of revenge. I used my access to the Sterling Foundation's digital back-end access. Julian hadn't been smart enough to revoke to trace the vines. I found the shell companies, the dormant trusts, and the political donations. I didn't just find them. I prepared them for a massive disclosure event. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to commit the greatest act of academic and financial suicide in the history of the state. I was going to publish every ledger, every wire transfer, and every dark secret of the Sterling and Kensington families on the university's public server. But as I was preparing the final upload, my screen flickered. A video call request appeared. It was Julian. He was in a holding cell, his face bruised, his eyes wild with terror. But he wasn't alone. Standing behind him, barely visible in the shadows of the cell, was a man I recognized from the shadow manifests. It was Silas Blackwood's father, the patriarch of the Blackwood underworld. "Dad," Julian sobbed, his voice cracking. "Please, they're going to kill me. Silas is gone, but his father. He says you have the master ledger. He says if you don't hand it over to their lawyers tonight, I won't make it to the morning." I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the enter key that would destroy the Blackwoods' leverage forever. "Alaric," the elder Blackwood's voice came from the shadows, a rasping, ancient sound. "Don't be a fool. You've had your fun with the girl and the Kensingtons. But the Blackwood interests are eternal. Hand over the ledger and I'll ensure Julian is moved to a private facility where he'll be safe. Refuse, and the Sterling line ends tonight." I looked at my son, the man who had plotted to kill me, the man who had helped Sloane murder his own mother. He was a coward, a thief, and a traitor, but he was my son. "I have a counteroffer," I said, my voice steady even as my heart felt like it was being crushed by a vice. "I'm listening," Blackwood said. "I'm going to give you exactly what you want," I said, "but you're going to have to come to the Gables to get it, and you're going to bring Julian with you." "Why the house, Professor?" "Because," I said, a dark, jagged smile crossing my face, "that house was built for a reckoning, and I want to see the look on your face when you realize that the Sterlings finally learned how to settle their debts." I cut the feed. I didn't upload the files. Not yet. I called Claire. "I need you to get the FBI to the estate, but don't move until I give the signal. I'm bringing the entire Blackwood organization into one room." "Alaric, you're baiting a trap with yourself," she warned. "I've spent my life studying the past, Claire," I said, standing up and grabbing my briefcase. "It's time I started making some history of my own." I didn't know it then, but the master ledger wasn't just a book of names. It was a map, and the final destination was a place none of us were meant to walk away from. The Gables at midnight was no longer a home. It was a sarcophagus of cold stone and curated lies. I stood in the center of the great hall, the towering ceilings vanishing into shadows that seemed to pulse with the weight of a century's worth of secrets. I had turned off the modern security system, the one Sloane had subverted, and replaced it with something far older and more reliable, the house's original mechanical bones. I wasn't the man I had been a week ago. That man, the one who cared about the prestige of a Harvard chair and the polite veneer of old money, had been buried alongside the realization that his legacy was built on the trafficking of human souls. I had spent 40 years teaching history, but I was finally ready to live it. I heard the heavy thrum of high-end engines echoing up the driveway. 3 black SUVs crested the hill, their headlights cutting through the fog like the eyes of deep-sea predators. They didn't bother with stealth. Arrogance was the Blackwood family's defining trait. They had owned this coast for so long they had forgotten what it felt like to be hunted. I moved to the library and sat behind my mahogany desk. On the surface lay the master ledger, its leather binding cracked and smelling of salt and rot. Beside it sat a single glass of 20-year-old scotch, untouched. I wasn't drinking tonight. I needed every neuron firing with the precision of a clockwork trigger. The front doors were kicked open. The sound boomed through the house, a violent punctuation to the silence. Footsteps, heavy, rhythmic, and numerous, approached the library. Silas Blackwood's father, Vane Blackwood, walked in first. He was 80 years old, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that couldn't hide the fact that he was a creature made of gristle and malice. Behind him, 2 men in tactical gear dragged Julian, My son looked like a ghost of a man. His face was a map of bruises, his eyes vacant and wet with terror. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw the little boy who used to be afraid of the dark. "Dad," he croaked. I didn't look at him. If I looked at him, I might remember I was a father, and tonight I needed to be a judge. "Vane," I said, my voice steady, "you've made a mess of my foyer." Vane Blackwood didn't smile. He walked to the desk and looked down at the ledger. "You've made a mess of my business, Alaric. You and that bitch of a daughter-in-law. She thought she could play in the deep end without knowing how to swim." "Sloane is a Kensington," I replied. "They're scavengers. They don't swim. They wait for the tide to bring the wreckage to them. But you're a shark. And you've brought a very pathetic piece of bait with you." Vane gestured to Julian. "The boy is a debt. A Sterling debt. His mother knew it. His wife knew it. And now you know it. Give me the ledger, and I'll leave the boy here. You can spend your remaining years trying to fix what's left of him." "And the offshore manifests?" I asked. "The ones that prove the Blackwood and Sterling shipping lines were one and the same? They're mine now," Vane said, his voice a low growl. "I've already had my hackers scrub the university servers. Whatever you thought you were going to upload is gone. You're holding a book of ghosts, Alaric. It has no power in the modern world." I ran my hand over the ledger. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to prove that the modern world was still built on the foundations of the ancient one. "You're right, Vane," I said. "This book is just paper. The names in here are dead. But history isn't just about names. It's about consequences. Do you know why my father built this library with 3-foot-thick limestone walls and a reinforced steel substructure?" Vane narrowed his eyes. He was a paranoid drunk. He was a man who knew he was building a vault for the devil. I said, standing up. "He didn't just build a house. He built a trap. He knew that eventually a Blackwood would come into this room and try to take back what he thought was his." I reached under the desk and pressed a small brass toggle, a manual override that hadn't been touched in 60 years. The sound of heavy iron shutters slamming shut echoed through the house. The library windows were suddenly obscured by 3-inch thick steel plates. The door we had entered through didn't just close, it sealed with the hiss of a pressurized vault. Vane's men reacted instantly, pulling their sidearms, but they had nothing to shoot. I was behind the desk, and the desk was bolted to the floor. "What is this?" Vane hissed, his hand reaching for his cane. "This is the end of the Sterling and Blackwood merger," I said. "You think you scrubbed the servers? You scrubbed the public ones, Vane, but I'm a scholar. I know that the only way to preserve a document is to make sure it exists in multiple, unlinked locations." I pointed to the ceiling. "Every word of that ledger, every wire transfer, every murder confession Sloane made in that warehouse, it's being broadcast right now. Not to a server. To every major news outlet in the country, via an encrypted satellite uplink managed by Special Agent Claire Harrison." "You're lying," Vane said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm a historian, Vane. I don't lie about the record. And here is the part you really missed. I didn't just send the financial records. I sent the Blackwood manifests. The ones from the 1920s through the 1990s. The ones that prove your family's involvement in the disappearances of those federal agents in '84. Vane's face went the color of curdled milk. The Blackwoods had survived for a century because they kept their crimes profitable and quiet. Exposure was the only thing that could kill them. "You're in here with us, Alaric," Julian cried out, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You'll die too. The FBI, they'll arrest everyone." "I've already lost everything, Julian," I said, finally looking at him. "Your mother is dead. My son is a murderer. My name is a curse. I'm not looking for an exit. I'm looking for a conclusion." Suddenly the house shook. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the sound of a heavy-lift helicopter hovering directly over the Great Hall. "The FBI is here, Vane," I said, "but they aren't coming in through the doors. They're waiting for the signal, and the signal is me. You think you can just hand us over?" Vane laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "I have enough lawyers to keep this in court until you're dust. I'll be out on bail by morning." "Not for this," I said. I reached into the master ledger and pulled out a small, modern electronic device. It was a remote detonator. "This house is a monument to blood, Vane," I said. "Beneath this library is the fallout shelter Claire showed me. But beneath that, beneath the foundation, is the old coal cellar. I've spent the last 12 hours filling it with enough industrial accelerant to turn this limestone into a kiln." "You're insane," Vane whispered. "I'm a Sterling," I countered. "We don't leave things half-finished." I looked at Julian. I wanted you to be better than me. I wanted you to be a man of peace. But you chose to be a Blackwood. You chose the debt. Now, you're going to help pay it." The psychological tension in the room snapped. One of Vane's guards lunged for the desk, but I didn't hesitate. I didn't press the detonator, not yet. I pressed the second toggle. The floor beneath the desk didn't drop. Instead, the wall behind me, the mahogany paneling I'd lived with for decades, slid away to reveal a direct view of the great hall. There, standing in the center of the hall, was Sloane. She wasn't in handcuffs. She was holding a tactical rifle, and she was surrounded by 3 men I didn't recognize. Not Blackwood's men, not the FBI. "Did you really think I'd stay in a jail cell for more than an hour, Alaric?" Sloane's voice came through the library's intercom, cold and mocking. "The Kensingtons don't just have lawyers, we have the people who appoint the judges." She looked at Vane Blackwood through the reinforced glass. "Vane, you're old, you're slow, and you're holding onto a ledger that belongs to the new generation. Alaric was right about one thing, the keystone has to be pulled. But it's not him, it's you." Sloane raised the rifle and fired a single, precise shot into the reinforced glass. It didn't shatter, but it spiderwebbed. "I'm taking the foundation, Alaric," she said, "and I'm taking the Blackwood assets. Julian was just the bridge. Now that the bridge is crossed, I don't need it anymore." She looked at Julian, her expression one of utter indifference. "Goodbye, Julian. You were a terrible husband, but you were an excellent catalyst." The betrayal within the betrayal was complete. Sloane wasn't a victim, and she wasn't just a co-conspirator. She was the architect of the entire collapse. She had used the FBI to clear out the old guard, used me to find the ledger, and now she was here to eliminate the witnesses. What happened next changed the course of the night. I didn't press the detonator. I looked at Vane Blackwood, the man who had been my family's shadow for a century. "She's going to kill us all, Vane," I said. "Even you. She's the history you didn't see coming." Vane looked at Sloane, then at me. For the first time, I saw something like respect in his eyes, the respect of one dying predator for another. "The girl is ambitious," Vane rasped. "But she forgot the first rule of the docks." "What's that?" I asked. "Never stand on the trap door when you're holding the rope," Vane said. He reached into his cane and pulled out a small, silver whistle. He blew it, but no sound came out. It was a high-frequency trigger. Suddenly, the great hall erupted. The floorboards didn't just buckle, they exploded upward. Claire Harrison and a team of FBI HRT operators didn't come through the doors, they came through the secret passages I had shown Claire earlier that morning. Sloane began to fire, a frantic, wild spray of lead, but she was outmatched. The room became a blur of flashbangs and tactical commands. In the chaos, I looked at the remote in my hand. The signal wasn't for the fire. It was for the truth. I pressed the button, but instead of an explosion, every screen in the house and every screen on the satellite uplink switched to a single, grainy video. It was Eleanor. But she wasn't in a hospital. She was in this very library 3 years ago, and she was talking to Sloane. "I know what you are, Sloane." Eleanor's voice filled the house, amplified by the sound system. "And I know what you're planning for Alaric. But you should know. The Sterling wealth isn't in the accounts. It's in the walls. And I've already ensured that if you ever try to take it, you'll be the one who pays the price." Sloane froze in the great hall, her rifle lowering. "What?" "The shadow manifests aren't just financial records, Sloane," Eleanor's recorded voice whispered. "They're a confession. My confession, and yours." I looked at the ledger on my desk. I flipped to the very back, to a section I hadn't seen before. There, in Eleanor's perfect script, was a list of every bribe Sloane had ever paid, every person she had ever hurt, and the exact coordinates of the bodies Silas Blackwood had buried for her. The hidden truth was out. Sloane wasn't just a greedy socialite, she was a serial killer by proxy. Sloane looked up at the library glass, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She realized then that she hadn't been playing me. She had been playing a dead woman who was 10 times smarter than she would ever be. "I'll kill you," Sloane screamed, lunging for the glass. "No, Sloane," I said, my voice cold and final. "You'll just be a footnote." I hit the final switch. The library didn't explode, but the gables began to tilt. The limestone foundation, compromised by the old coal shafts I'd opened, began to settle into the earth. The house was literally sinking into the darkness it was built upon. "Claire, get him out!" I yelled into the radio. The FBI team grabbed a screaming Sloane and a catatonic Julian, dragging them toward the exits as the stone walls began to groan and crack. I stayed in the chair. "Alaric, get out of there!" Claire's voice crackled through the intercom. I looked at Vane Blackwood. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the steel door, looking at the ceiling. He knew it was over. "Go, Professor," Vane said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Someone has to tell the story. I'd rather it be the man who hated me than the girl who tried to be me." I grabbed the ledger and the recording of Eleanor. I moved to the secret passage behind the bookshelf, the one that led to the ravine. As I stepped into the tunnel, I looked back one last time. The Gables was screaming, the sound of stone grinding against stone like a dying beast. I emerged into the cold night air just as the west wing collapsed in a cloud of dust and ancient secrets. I was at rock bottom. I had no home, no family, and a name that was now synonymous with a century of crime. But as I watched the dust settle over the ruins of my life, I felt a strange, terrifying freedom. The Sterling legacy was dead, but Alaric Sterling was still here, and I had the ledger. What happened next changed everything, because as I walked toward the FBI perimeter, a single black sedan pulled up, the window rolled down, and a woman I hadn't seen in 30 years, Eleanor's sister, the one Claire said was dead, looked at me. "The house had to fall, Alaric," she said. "But the foundation is still there. Are you ready to find out where the money really went?" I didn't know it yet, but the revenge wasn't over. It was just moving to a global stage. The dust from the collapse of the Gables hung in the air like a localized storm, a fine powder of limestone and pulverized history that coated my lungs. I stood by the black sedan, my hand still gripping the leather-bound ledger, the only thing I had saved from the ruin of my life. Vivian Sterling, the woman I had been told died in a sanitarium 3 decades ago, sat behind the wheel, her face a map of the same elegant resolve I had once seen in Eleanor. The house was the heart of the beast, Alaric, Vivian said, her voice cutting through the distant wail of secondary sirens. "But the blood is still in the system. Get in. We have 3 hours before the federal grand jury convenes, and you're the only person who can provide the context they need to finish this." I didn't ask questions. A week ago, I would have demanded evidence, cited sources, and looked for logical fallacies, but I had seen my own son try to lead me to a watery grave, and I had watched my daughter-in-law treat murder like a corporate restructuring. The time for academic debate was over. As we drove away from the sinking remains of the Sterling legacy, Vivian explained the final layer of the lie. Eleanor hadn't just been an informant, she had been the architect of a slow-burn financial assassination. She had known that simply arresting Sloane or Julian wouldn't be enough. The old money networks of the Kensingtons and Blackwoods were like a hydra cut off one head, and the legal fees and political favors would grow 2 more. Eleanor realized the only way to kill a monster is to starve it, Vivian whispered, her eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. "She didn't just hide the money, Alaric, she converted it. Every cent of the Sterling blood fortune, the trafficking profits, the industrial bribes, the illegal shipping lanes, it was moved through a series of dark pools and re-emerged as the Eleanor Sterling Reparations Trust. It's a closed loop. The only person who can unlock it is you, using the key embedded in that ledger." "And the money?" I asked. "It's already being distributed," she said, a faint, ghost-like smile touching her lips. "To the descendants of the families mentioned in the manifests. To the victims of the Blackwood docks." Sloane and Julian were chasing a phantom, Alaric. They thought they were fighting for an inheritance. They were actually fighting over an empty vault. The trial of the century began 6 months later in a federal courthouse in Boston. It was a spectacle of American drama, a collision of old money, prestige, and modern depravity. Sloane Kensington sat at the defense table, her hair perfectly coiffed, her eyes still burning with that terrifying, predatory intelligence. She had hired the best legal team in the country, men who specialized in making the truth look like an opinion. Julian sat beside her, though they didn't speak. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. He had lost 30 pounds, his skin was the color of parchment, and his hands never stopped shaking. He wasn't the antagonist of this story anymore. He was the collateral damage of his own greed. I didn't know it yet, but the most satisfying moment of my life wasn't going to be the verdict. It was going to be the testimony. When I took the stand, the courtroom fell into a silence so heavy it felt physical. I didn't look at the jury. I didn't look at the cameras. I looked directly at Sloane. "Professor Sterling," the lead prosecutor began, "can you describe the events of the flight to East Hampton?" I didn't just describe them, I deconstructed them. I spoke for 4 hours not as a victim, but as a historian. I laid out the Sterling pattern, the century of exploitation that had led to that moment in the airplane cabin. I revealed the contents of the ledger, the recording of Eleanor's final days, and the systematic gaslighting Sloane had used to erase my mind. Sloane Kensington didn't just want my money, I told the court, my voice echoing off the marble walls. She wanted my history. She wanted to rewrite the Sterling name to suit her own ambition. She believed that if she controlled the narrative, she controlled the truth. But she forgot one thing. History isn't just what we say, it's what we leave behind. The defense tried to break me. They brought up my cognitive decline, citing the fake reports from Dr. Thorne. They called me a delusional, grieving widower who had fabricated a conspiracy to explain his own son's failures. Then, we called the surprise witness. Cassidy Vane, the flight attendant, walked into the courtroom. But she wasn't just a flight attendant. She was the woman who had recorded Sloane's confession in the airport lounge, and she was followed by a line of 20 former employees of the Kensington Medical Center, all of whom had been granted immunity to speak about the special projects Sloane had overseen. The collapse was total. Sloane was found guilty on 18 counts, including conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and elder financial abuse. She was sentenced to 40 years without the possibility of parole. As they led her out of the courtroom, she finally looked at me. There was no remorse in her eyes, only a cold, lingering hatred. "You're still a Sterling, Alaric," she hissed as she passed. "You're still part of the rot." "No, Sloane," I said, my voice quiet enough for only her to hear. "I'm the one who finally cut it out." Julian's fate was different. He was sentenced to 10 years for his role in the fraud and the conspiracy. Because he had cooperated with the FBI in the final hours to save his own skin, he avoided the murder charges, but his punishment was worse than a cell. He was a Sterling without a name, a man without a home, and a son without a father. A week after the sentencing, I visited him in the federal holding facility. We sat on opposite sides of a glass partition. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking, I'm so sorry. Sloane, she told me you were going to cut me off. She said you were going to leave everything to the university. I just wanted what was mine." "What was yours was a pile of ashes, Julian," I said, feeling a strange, distant pity for the man who shared my blood but none of my soul. "You traded your mother's life and your father's love for a ledger of debts. Was it worth it?" He didn't answer. He just cried the small, pathetic sobs of a man who realized too late that he had been the architect of his own prison. "I'm leaving, Julian," I said, standing up. "I've sold the land where the gables stood. I'm giving the proceeds to the Reparations Trust. I'm moving to a small house in the coastal hills of Maine. I'm going to spend my time writing a new book, a true one. Will I see you again?" I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I saw him clearly, not as my son, but as a historical footnote. A warning of what happens when a legacy is built on nothing but a name. "I don't think so," I said. "In my history, Julian, you've already been erased." I walked out of the prison and into the crisp autumn air of a New England afternoon. Vivian was waiting for me in the car. We drove north, away from the prestige, away from the scandals, and away from the Sterling name that had once meant everything and now meant nothing. I didn't know it then. But the final twist wasn't in a ledger or a recording. It was in the silence of my new home. I spent my mornings watching the Atlantic waves crash against the Maine granite, the same waves that had once carried my ancestors' ships. One evening, while unpacking the last of my books, I found a small envelope tucked into the back of my old briefcase, the one I'd been holding on the plane. It was from Eleanor. It hadn't been in the library or the safe. It had been with me the entire time. I opened it. Inside was a single photograph of the three of us, Julian, Eleanor, and me, at the beach when Julian was 6 years old. On the back, in Eleanor's elegant script, were 4 words. "Forgive the boy. Remember the truth." I sat by the fireplace and watched the photo for a long time. The boy was gone, replaced by a man who had chosen darkness. But the truth was still here. I realized then that the ultimate revenge wasn't seeing Sloane in a cell or Julian in a prison yard. The ultimate revenge was outliving the lie. I was 72 years old, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't a Sterling. I wasn't a professor. I wasn't a victim. I was just a man. And as I tossed the photograph into the fire, watching the edges curl and blacken, I felt the final open loop close. The Sterling history was over. The moral of the story, I suppose, is something I should have taught my students long ago. You cannot build a future on a past you are afraid to look at. Legacy is a burden only if you carry the sins along with the gold. I picked up my pen and began to write. In the beginning, there were the Sterlings. And in the end, there was only the truth. The house was quiet. The fire was warm. Leather first time in my life. I was at peace.